We're going to make a fun little ruffly trimmed kitchen towel. So let me show you what all the supplies are here. The towel that I'm using is the March 2021 blank of the month from Artistry. It's a polyester sports towel that you can do sublimation on, and I have used my Artistry markers to make this fun little sublimation print that says "You make my heart beat," B-E-E-T, because it's for my kitchen. And I found that image on my Cricut design space, and I actually just printed it out from the design space. I just printed it out and colored it in on the back side, and there will be a tutorial later showing you how that all works. Then in addition to this hand towel, you also need, of course, your fabric-y bits. So I found some fabric that works nicely with my little design, and it's just a nice cotton fabric that I have pre-washed, because you want to pre-wash everything, and so that if things shrink, they shrink before you sew them together, and you don't come up with something that makes you sad after you wash your finished item the first time. I have a ruler, I have scissors, of course my Artistry stuff, and some pins. Very important to have some straight pins. So these are all the supplies you need, and let's get going on making that ruffle. The first thing you need to do to make your ruffle is measure the perimeter of your towel. So measure all around your towel, okay? And I measured all the way around my towel, and it was 58 inches. Next, what you need to do is add 6 inches onto that. So 58 plus 6 is 64. Okay, so my towel perimeter, we're calling it 64 inches. I know that's the perimeter plus 6 inches, but we're just gonna say we got 64 inches for the perimeter is what we're using. And now what I need is I need a piece of my fabric that's 1 3/4 inches wide by that perimeter long. So I need to cut this fabric at 1 3/4. And one of the really nice things about quilting fabric is that it is very often tearable in a straight line. So I mark my 1 3/4 inches, and I'm just going to give it a little clip there. And then I can just tear. Okay, so I need it at 1 3/4 by 64 inches. This is not 64 inches, so I'm going to need to do another piece that's 1 3/4, and I'll just have to seam it together, and that's totally fine. Okay, so for 1 3/4 by 64, I actually need 2 of these to seam together. So here I'm doing the other one. You can mark that with a pencil and then clip it. Totally fine. Okay, so now that will be, once I seam it together, it'll be 1 3/4 by 64. What you actually need is you're going to need 2 of those pieces, okay? But I already did the first one, so that's why I'm only tearing out 1 of them. But you'll need 2 pieces that are 1 3/4 inch wide by 64, or the perimeter of your towel plus 6 inches long. 2 of them. Once you have those pieces, you might have to seam them together and give them a press to make them flat and everything. Then what you're going to do with those 2 pieces is just fold over and press one of the long sides 1/2 inch. So it is now, I folded that over and pressed it 1/2 inch, so it's now 1 1/4 by 64, and you need 2 of those. Then the next piece you need is a 3 inch wide piece. Okay, so this is 3 inches. That is twice the length of the other 2. Okay, so the other 2 pieces were 64 inches. This needs to be 128 inches. So this piece, I obviously had to tear out several of them and seam them together, is 3 inches by 168 inches. I get that all cut out, seamed together, and then once I have that full piece, I give it a press, and then the next thing you do is fold it in half and press it in half. So it is now, my finished piece pressed in half is now 1 1/2 inches by 168 inches. Okay, so those are the 3 pieces you need. Now we're ready for the next step, which is putting together that trim And the first thing we do is we take one of our pieces that has just the 1/2 inch fold over, and we need to divide it up. I'm going to show you how to do that dividing up in a moment, but let me just explain it to you first. What I did was I took this piece and I folded it in half and put a pin on the cut end, not on the folded end, but on the cut or torn end. So I folded it in half, I put a pin in the half, opened it back up, folded those both in half, put pins in those halves. And I kept dividing halves and halves and halves until my sections were smaller than 6 inches. You see, like this section is bigger than 6 inches, so I did it one more time to get this section that's smaller than 6 inches. I'll show you that in a moment. I'll actually show you how to do that on another one. You only need to do that on one of your pieces, that is one of your shorter pieces, not both of the shorter pieces. Now, once you've done that, you take your folded in half piece and you need to put a gathering stitch in it. Now, when I was younger, I learned and was learning to sew. I learned to do a gathering stitch by doing 2 parallel sets of stitches that were the longest possible straight stitch my machine would do. And then you could pull just like the bottom threads or the top threads, whichever set, and do the gather. But that never worked well for me, and I always dreaded gathering. I would always break my threads, and even though there were 2 parallel sets of stitching, I would still break them both. It was always a disaster. And then summer after my freshman year of undergrad, I went to summer stock, and the totally awesome costume designer there, Linda Consul, taught me this trick that I am madly in love with, use it ever since, and teach it to everybody I can because it is the greatest thing ever. I take a piece of crochet thread, okay? So here's my crochet thread. I set my sewing machine to the widest zigzag that I can get. And, you know, it can be kind of long. I think this zigzag looks like it's about a little over 1/8 of an inch long this way, you know, how long the stitch is, but I set it as wide as I can. So in this case, that looks like it's a little over 1/8 of an inch. And what I do is I zigzag all the way along my the edge of my piece that needs to be gathered, but I do the zigzag over top of this piece of crochet thread. So basically what that means is as I'm sewing along, I have my crochet thread on the edge of my fabric. So let's pretend like we're going to go on this edge here. I put the crochet thread on the edge of my fabric and I zigzag over top of it. So basically my sewing machine needle is going in here, and then here, and then here, and then here. So it's going over top of the crochet thread. The needle never actually goes into the crochet thread. What that does is it creates a little tunnel for the crochet thread. So you can see when I pull it, the crochet thread pulls and gathers up the fabric. And I don't have to worry about breaking it because it's a crochet thread. It's nice and strong, and it's not being stopped by anything. It hasn't been sewn through. If as you're pulling you find that you accidentally caught it with the machine at one point, what I do is you can easily find where that stitch was caught, because what'll happen is you'll have your pulling, your gathering, and then your gathering will like have just suddenly stopped because it hit a point where the machine thread went through the crochet thread. And what I'll do is I'll just clip that piece of machine thread that went through the crochet thread, pull it out, and then keep gathering. It might get a little funky right there, but then I'll kind of fix that with some pins if it does. But it's so much easier to fix because you're not going to break your crochet thread. You're just going to occasionally maybe have to clip one of the sewing machine threads if you ever caught it. Of course, this requires a steady hand while sewing in order to not sew through the crochet thread. So it's a little bit more difficult as far as the setup goes, but then actually making it gather, so much easier. I love that trick. So now that I've done that, I need to divide this ruffle piece into as many halves as I did for this piece. Now, rather than having to count these and keep track, what I know is since this is twice the size of this, when I've divided it into the right number of halves, my sections will be twice as large as these sections are. So my sections on this will actually be this big instead of this big. So I'm going to show you that technique now. So the first thing I do is fold this in half. Okay, so I fold it in half, and again, I need my pins to be on the cut end where the gathering is, not on the folded end. So I folded that in half and I marked it. Okay, so now I'm going to fold it in half again. So I take this end and bring it to where the pin is. Pretty soon I'm going to small enough it'll all stay within the camera, don't worry. And I'm going to mark it again. Okay, so now unfold it. I've got this little pin here, right? And I can fold this in half, mark up to the pin. Here we go. And put a pin in there. Open it up. Fold it in half again. Put a pin in, and now I can see that this little section that I just pinned a little messily, let me fix it. Okay, this little section that I just pinned is the size of 2 of these. So this is the right number of sections. So now I have to just keep going back and having the other sections that I have until they're the same size. So this little section is obviously too long. I'm going to fold it in half again, and that makes it the same size as the other ones. So I know I've got the same proportions going on here. Okay, then we got this section. It's a little bit bigger. I didn't have as many halves in this one yet. So I'm going to fold that in half again. Put my pin in on this side. Okay, and then this piece needs to be folded in half again. You just keep folding each of these little sections in half until they're all the same size. Then you know that you've got your same amount folded. Okay, so you know, if your technique is to fold it all and do a whole bunch of pins all at once, whatever floats your boat. The point is you just need to keep having and having and having until you have so many halves, the right amount of divisions. So here we go. So in this case now, at this point, I've got about half of it folded. I'm going to show you, let's say that we did it all, and I'm going to show you what the next step is. So I have my ribbon piece right side up, or my unpinned piece right side up. Then my piece that's going to be gathered goes on top of that. Then my other edging piece, non-gathered piece that actually has the pins, goes on top of that right side down. Now I pin the very end together. If I can pick it up, there we go. Pin the end together. All right. Now what I need to do is leave this bottom piece nice and flat. I'm going to take my piece that's being gathered and match the pin to the pin on the top piece that's not being gathered. And then you might actually, I mean, if you want to be really safe, you could pin the other shorter piece if you want. I'm not doing that. I'm just kind of lining it up so that all of the gathering piece is just floating in the center here. Now I'm holding all 3 layers together. I'm going to remove one pin. I'm going to take the other pin and use it to pin these all together. And when I go down, I'm actually going underneath that gathered stitch. Let me show you what I mean. All right, so I can feel where that thread is. Okay, you can feel it. And I actually put the pin in below that thread so that the gathering is happening above the pin. Okay, you could also pin around it if you're capable of doing that, so you can go in above it and come out below it. And that actually will hold everything nice and steady, nice and sturdy. Okay, so now I'm going to repeat that process. I'm taking the next pin on my top layer, matching it with the pin on my bottom layer, but I'm kind of, you can see I'm just kind of folding these up a little bit to get it all encased in there. Matching the pin on the middle layer and the top layer, and then making sure the bottom layer is flat. Doesn't have to be perfection. Okay, holding all 3 layers together. Top and bottom layers are flat, middle layer is all gathered in there. Remove one of the pins and then replace the other pin through all the layers. I'll show you that one more time. Okay, I've got the bottom layer flat here. I have my top layer. I'm going to pull it back. Take this little middle layer and just kind of, you know, accordion fold it up to get that gather inside here. And then match my top layer and my middle layer pins. Then pull that so the top layer is flat. Match it to the bottom layer. See? All that gathering inside. Remove one of the pins, use the other pin to pin everything together. Going to do that all the way across, which means you really do want to have all your pins in first, okay? So I will have to go and finish those pins before I can finish this. Once you've done that, what you'll be able to do is take a hold of your crochet thread and just start pulling it, and you can kind of push those gathers along. So you pull your crochet thread and see how nicely it gathers everything up, and then I can kind of push the gathers along to get them to past that pin to the next one. And if you're doing this and you get stopped at a pin, you must have pinned through your crochet thread, so just readjust the pin. And I usually do this from one side until I'm about halfway done. And then what I do once I get it about half of it gathered is I'll actually just tie this crochet thread together with the tails from the zigzag, and that'll hold it nice and tight, and then I'll pull from the other end. And you can see I have all my gathering in here. And I'll kind of, with my fingers, just kind of adjust the gathering so it's even between each set of pins. And then what you could do once you have all that done is you sew it together. So I'm going to finish all of my gathering. Then I'll come back and show you what it looks like. We'll talk about sewing that together. And then we'll sew it to the actual towel. Okay? Okay, so I have my entire little section, my entire little ruffle here, all ready to sew. It's my gathered section sandwiched between the other 2 sections. And now I'm going to take this over to my machine, and I'm just going to sew it with a normal straight stitch with a normal length and everything. I'm going to sew it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, okay? Okay, I've sewn my ruffle together with this 1/2 inch seam allowance, and now comes a really important part. What I need to do is clip next to these knots, okay? So I've got that one clipped, and let me find this end. All right, I'm clipping the knot in the crochet thread. And I forgot to tell you before, if you don't have crochet thread, but you do have quilting thread, you can use quilting thread as well. That works too. All right, so now what I need to do now that I've done that is I need to go ahead and grab a hold of that crochet thread and kind of see if I can release one of the ends. Hopefully you didn't sew over it, but sometimes I do. Look, I might have sewn over it right there. So where I sewed over it, I'm just going to kind of pull up right next to where I sewed over it here and give it a clip. Okay, you really shouldn't have sewn over it because it shouldn't have been that far away from the edge. But here, I'll just kind of cut off as much of that piece as I can. Okay, hopefully that's the only place where I sewed over it. But now you're just going to kind of pull that thread, and what you need to do is you need to remove your gathering thread. You can clip it in a couple spots and pull it out in more than one piece if you want to. That's totally fine. You need to remove it because it will affect the drape of your fabric if you leave it in there. It will, on something like this towel, it's maybe not such a big deal, but on garments and stuff, it can make a big difference. So just make a habit out of removing it. And I can feel that that was the only place that I sewed over it, of course. I did that on purpose. I wanted to show you that it could happen. Totally. Yeah, I meant to do that. So here I'm just pulling this gathering thread out. There we go. And I've pulled out that crochet thread. And now we have this nice gathered piece. It also takes a little of the thickness away. And now that we've done that, you can, if you want to, run this through a serger. Don't go over your 1/2 inch seam line, but you can run this through a serger just to hold it flat, or even just run an extra a zigzag or a straight stitch over here just to hold it a little flatter if you're worried about the bulk. But the next thing that's really important, I'm not going to do any of that. I'm just going to press. So press down one side, press it flat, turn it over, press the other side nice and flat, and then come back and we will get this attached to our towel. Yay!